Well, hey folks, Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver, where we look at current events and culture, politics, spirituality, all of it, as if human consciousness and culture were evolving. And not just evolving, but evolving into ever greater stages of goodness, truth, and beauty. That's sort of the main thesis of integral thinking. Now, there is a slight buzzkill, and that is that this goodness, truth, and beauty are evolving in an energetic polarity with their opposites. So goodness manifests in a certain kind of tension with badness, and truth evolves with untruth, and beauty manifests in a way that is in a dialectic opposition to ugliness. And that's a long story, but I just want to lay out that much of an integral worldview and an integral lens, because I want to use that lens to talk about something new that is manifesting in the world. And that is the phenomena of Jordan Peterson as an emergent public intellectual that is, really getting a lot of attention. And I got a lot of requests from people to talk about Jordan Peterson, to try to put him in an integral context. And I also assume that I will be having people watch this who coming in more from the Jordan Peterson side of the street and may not know much about integral. So I'm going to try to do both as best I can. So first, let me just start with just a quick sort of synopsis of who he is and why he is getting so much attention. First of all, he's a professor. He was a professor at Harvard. He's a professor at the University of Toronto in Canada. And his new home is really YouTube at this point, and also the publishing industry. He's written a new bestseller called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos, which is #1 on bestseller lists across the developed world. I think it's up to 600,000 copies now. And at YouTube, his videos have attracted, I've heard estimates from 40 million to 200 million views, but a lot at any rate. And he has been commented on in all the magazines and the commentators and me now, and he's worthy. He's very interesting, and he's bringing on something really new that I think is evolutionarily potent. And I got to say that, he's hitting a nerve in the culture, and as evolutionaries, we're always interested in what's hitting a nerve in the culture. And I have to say that he's hit a nerve in me. I really like the guy. I feel like he's doing God's work, and he is a fighter. And that comes in handy when, so much of evolution is about how we fight our way forward. The other F word, our way forward too, but that's another story for another podcast. But he's a fighter. And I have to say, just to sort of cut to the chase, that I do think he's a sandwich or two short of an integral picnic, but that doesn't mean he's not contributing to cultural evolution, and maybe we can set him straight here. So anyway, what got Jordan Peterson launched, and let's remember that he was a virtual unknown a year and a half ago. It was September 2016, so whatever that is, 18, 19 months ago. And this is, Hillary and Trump coming down the wire in this election, and all the attention's there, when this, semi-obscure professor at University of Toronto publishes a YouTube of a lecture. He just videotaped his lecture, where he claimed that a newly passed law in Canada, which adds gender identity to the Civil Rights Code and makes it illegal to discriminate against transgendered people. And this new code includes a requirement to use non-binary pronouns when, with transgendered people. And in his video, he argued, in this lecture, he argued that this amounted to compelled speech, an infringement on his freedom of speech, and he refused to do it. And so I'm going to play just a taste of this particular YouTube, and where he sort of just explains the gist of his argument.
Okay, so this is the scenario I've been running through my head. I can envision a student or a colleague insisting that I call them using gender-neutral pronouns, je, Z-H-E, or Z-H-E for you Americans, je or je, I think it is. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. I think it's manipulative. I don't recognize another person's right to determine what pronouns I use to address them. I won't do it. Now, again, I think that because of these new laws, that my decision might be illegal, and maybe it's even a decision of hate, but I'm not doing it. I think that those gender-neutral pronouns are politically motivated. I think they're connected to an entire underground apparatus of political motivations, radical left political motivations. And I think uttering those words makes me a tool of those motivations. And I'm going to try to be a tool of my own motivations as clearly as I can articulate them, and not the mouthpiece of some murderous ideology.
And so there, you hear terms like radical left, murderous ideology at the end, and he's not going to be a part of this big underground ideology that, what he's talking about here are these hideous movements of the mid-20th century, collectivism, Marxism, Maoism, fascism, and that's Peterson's story. That's his worldview, is that the West, that Western culture rose out of barbarism because of Christianity. And the reason that Christianity was so potent in doing that is because it recognizes the sanctity of the individual. And this is a big deal for Peterson. And this idea of the individual, which is where all creativity and morality resides, that sets off this virtual cycle that results in the triumph of Western culture in terms of all of the gifts of modernity, freedom, democracy, material wealth and decency, doubled lifespans, all of that good stuff. But that there's a double-edged sword here, and that as we lose our religion, which is what science and technology and modernity also does, it undermines religion. It tries to wring the superstition out of the system. That we're drawn then, because we're bereft of meaning, we're drawn to these great secular murderous ideologies of the 20th century, we just talked about, all of which are a disaster. And all of which have been defeated for now, and World War II was decisive in that, but they are rising again in the form of a radical left with an agenda to supplant Western civilization with an updated ideology of leftism, but still basically tied to those ideologies of identity politics, moral relativism, multiculturalism. This is the updated version, but it is a wrong turn in society and a return to collective tribal politics that have been disastrous in the past. So that's, in a nutshell, what Peterson sees. So here's the difference between what he sees and what integral sees. And here's what integral theory sees, which is that there is a natural evolution of cultures and also individual consciousness that have moved through several stages of development. And there's three that are currently dominating the scene, particularly in the developed world, and they are all struggling for supremacy. And this is the culture war. And these three stages are traditionalism, that is the social conservatives, religious people, patriotic, nationalistic, ethnocentric. These are the people who are in America, at least, a lot of the hardcore Trump supporters, not all of them by any means, but that's where the center of gravity is. Then there's the modern stage of development, which came online about, 500 years ago, and with the scientific revolution and then the Enlightenment. And again, Peterson traces its roots back to Christianity. But there's a rationality that comes online, and a secularism, actually, achievement-oriented, pragmatic. It's the home of science and technology, and it is responsible for this great flourishing of humanity where we have created the modern world. Not without its problems. All of these stages have problems, but they also have great benefits. And then there's the third stage, that's online currently, and that's postmodernity. And this is the worldview that is multicultural. It's world-centric. It finds patriotism and religion a little embarrassing and contracted, and it sees all the problems. Every stage sees the problems of the previous one. That's one of the reasons they evolve into a new stage. They're tired of it. They're bored with it. And actually, the truth is, they've installed the best parts of it. Even though they would not admit it. But at any rate, the postmodernity is also the home of progressive politics around civil rights, the sexual revolution, feminism, gay rights, animal rights, ecology. They're the people who are concerned about global warming and so forth. And as I said, every stage has what Ken Wilber refers to as its dignities and its disasters. And the disaster is always some form of totalitarianism. I mean, each of these stages thinks that it's the only one that has it right, and the other ones have it wrong. So traditionalism thinks that the world would be best if everybody became whatever religion you are, Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or whatever it might be. And also very, very culturally ethnocentric. And it has its zealots and fanatics. I mean, do we really have to, talk about religious fanatics? The world has been plagued with them. So that's the totalitarian side of traditionalism. Modernity also has this idea that the world will be set right when everybody becomes rational, logical, and we leave all of the animal spirits and superstitions behind, all the mythology, all of that, all the cruelties of pre-modernity are left behind. And they also have their fanatics, if you will, and these are what we call the materialists, the people who think that consciousness is reducible to the brain, that there's no free will or interiority or spiritual life. These are all subjective illusions of basically exterior, of atoms and cells and molecules and synapses and that sort of thing. And Peterson opposes this ideology of materialism. And he's had some very interesting talks with Sam Harris, sort of interesting, sort of frustrating too in a way. But he's about to debate or have a discussion with Steven Pinker, who's also a materialist. And but I love what Peterson says. He says, I see no reason why dead matter should have ontological superiority to living spirit. And I would agree with that. And so that's I think, a tonic to the zealots of modernity. And of course, then postmodernity comes in, and it has this idea of, think of the lyrics of the song Imagine. That we're post-religion, we're post-country, it's world-centric. Imagine all the people living in their lives in peace. And but in order to get there, we have to dismantle all of the power dynamics of history. And that's how they see history, as basically a series of dominator hierarchies, where, the chief of which is the white Western patriarchy, which has a illegitimate hegemony on the world, and they have their zealots and fanatics too, who believe that Western civilization is a criminal enterprise and needs to be, dismantled, basically. So that's an integral view, and we could even say that there's stages that are in either side of these three stages, and there's a new stage that this is the claim of integral theory, that there's a new stage that is arising out of postmodernity. It's the postmodern stage. And we call it integral because it integrates the best of all previous stages. And it holds paradox. It values science and spirit, sees culture and consciousness as evolving. It's everybody's friend and nobody's fool. And I like that. But mainly, it tries to integrate the best of all the previous stages. So it wants the sensitivity of postmodernity. It wants the casting off of dominator hierarchies that postmodernity wants. It wants this idea of freedom, of expression and thought, of achievement, of growth, of self-expression, of being all that you can be that comes with modernity. And then it also wants the values of traditionalism, order, dignity, self-discipline, responsibility to self and family and community and to others, faith in a higher order. And so that's what integral tries to do, is to, integrate these things. And that's why we call it integral. But what it doesn't do is believe that postmodernity is a wrong turn in the evolutionary sequence. It believes that postmodernity is a appropriate and just as all previous stages, it is a radically different new stage of human development that has its amazing insights of, world centrism, post-ideological, the dismantling of these great narratives of history. And it also has its downside, where it wants to reduce everything into a flat, relative, meaningless, flatland is what we call it. At any rate, so that's the integral view. And so let's look and see, where does Jordan Peterson, where does he live in this schema of development? So we've already established that he is in opposition to postmodernity. The good side is he's opposed to the fanatics of postmodernity. The downside is that he has not differentiated that. So he has sort of a blanket opposition that gets very confusing to people, I think. By the way, postmodernity progressives hate him right back. They try to tar him with his worst adherents. These alt-right guys are sort of big on Peterson. They show up and protest his talks and all of that stuff, which all makes for, good YouTube. And he works it. He's not afraid. He's a fighter. They're fighters. And, from an integral point of view, we do recognize that evolution happens. Evolution is red in tooth and claw, as they say. And that's one of the ways we fight our way forward. But I would also point out that Jordan Peterson is actually de facto progressive postmodern himself, in an adequate way, at least. And here's a couple reasons I would say that. One is he's a psychologist, and psychology is a green science in a way. When we move into postmodernity, we get really interested in our own interiority. I was way more interested in my interiority than my parents were interested in theirs, for instance. And, the idea of the unconscious comes online. The Jungian archetypes. He's a big fan of Freud and Jung. He has a big download of all of this. So he's involved in it. Also, he is very sensitive. It's funny. He's very emotional, and he does these YouTubes where he cries. And I was going to show you one. There's this one letter to the world that he did over New Year's, and he can barely finish it because of his crying. And it just felt a little maudlin. It's online. You can see it. I don't know. All those emotions make me nervous. But at any rate, I will note that modernists don't do that. Traditionalists do, but modernists don't. And so he has a sort of that sensitivity that, in postmodernity often is used to trump facts and arguments. Anyway. So he sees himself as being what he calls a classic liberal, and I'm going to play a little piece where he talks about that, and this is from a well-known interview that he. What is it? I see 2,800,000 views. This is a very seminal interview he had with Joe Rogan on the Joe Rogan Experience, and so I'm going to share that, and he's going to talk about his defense of the left.
You might say, well, why is the left wing necessary? Let's put it that way. And then a subset of that would be, well, why is the left wing attractive? Well, the left wing is necessary because inequality does spiral out of control. And so there has to be a political voice for the dispossessed. And you don't want people to stack up at zero, where they can't play the game at all. It's a bad idea. Not only do you not, if people stack up at zero, they're too poor to get ahead at all, let's say. They're too poor to open a bank account. They're too poor to buy enough food. Like they're stuck at zero and they can't get out of it. It's a really bad scene because, first of all, that's a lot of suffering. And that's not so good. Second of all, well, at least in principle, a lot of those people might be, might have something to offer the world, or their children might. And you want to open up avenues of opportunity to them so that they can succeed, but so that everyone else can benefit from their success. So, and then the next thing is, well, if the inequality gets out of hand too much, then the whole society starts to destabilize, because if you get enough people stacked up at zero, especially young men, you get enough young men stacked up at zero, they think, oh, to hell with it, we'll just flip the whole board over and it'll settle in a new configuration, and maybe we won't be stuck at zero in the new configuration. So it foments revolutionary thinking. So there's lots of reasons to be concerned about inequality. And so you need a voice on the left to say, look, we got to parameterize the tendency towards inequality so that it doesn't destabilize the entire society, so that everybody has an opportunity to advance.
All right. So, that is a fundamentally green point of view. And it is in opposition to a certain kind of a modern point of view, which tends to the libertarian laissez-faire philosophy. He does make a case, and he's about to go into it, for the equality of opportunity, not outcome. And this is where he really moves into the modern world. So he's clearly has a foot in the modern world too. I mean, big time. He's in academia. He's a modern guy. But he is not for the equality of outcome, where the idea is if there isn't a certain representation of race and women in a particular profession, that is by definition a function of discrimination and oppression. It may be a function of preference. It may be a function of history. Modernity tries to basically ignore the interiority and just work with the exteriors of racism, opportunity, and so forth. So, that's a limit of modernity, but it's also its strength, because when you're working just with what's measurable, there's a certain objectivity that comes online that helps to true up the system. And we actually want that. The other thing that is deeply modern in Jordan Peterson is his just deep commitment to free speech. and this idea that sovereignty lies in the heart and breast of every human being. And that's a big modern realization, particularly over traditionalism, where the sovereignty lied in the king or queen. And so that is a modern insight. And he, you could see this, the whole thing that got him going was his rejection, his chafing against the controls on his thought and speech. And so, adequately postmodern, adequately modern. So where is he in the traditional scale? And this is where his heart is, in a way. Again, he rejects materialism. He has a sort of a religious disposition, even though he has sort of conflicting ideas of religion. Is the Bible true? And he I'm actually going to talk about his relationship with religion later on, and I'm going to do a part 2 to this. But this is part 1. And so I just want to say that he has sort of an ambivalence about religion in terms of it being true, that I think integral thinking would actually help him to integrate. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But he is deeply tied and deeply at home and deeply seeing the need for classic traditional values to come back online, particularly for young people and particularly for young men. And you could really see this in his book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos. That's the title of this book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And you couldn't cram any more traditionalism into an 8-word title if you tried. Because that's really, if you look historically, that's what traditionalism does. And I'm going to share another screen here. And this is a more complete description of the stages of worldview evolution. And you can see that there's a stage before traditionalism that we call the warrior stage of development. There's actually a stage before that, tribal. There's a stage before that, archaic, just to sort of round it out. There's also a stage that goes beyond integral. And there's, presumably if evolution continues to continue, and why wouldn't it, there'll be many stages beyond integral. But we want to look at this warrior stage because what traditionalism does is it comes online in order to civilize the chaos of the previous stage. The warrior stage is egocentric. It oscillates between an indulgent indolence and a violent aggressiveness. So you can go either way. The idea is might is right. This is pre-truth in a way. This is pre-law. And, this is human history for most of human history before the great axial religions came online and basically civilized that by saying that, no, it's not might is right, it's right is right. And there is a transcendent right and there is a transcendent wrong, and you want to be on the right side of the street there and on God's side. So that traditionalism civilizes these chaotic impulses. And that's also true for us as individuals. And we see that happen in children. We move from the terrible twos and the terrible threes into a more civilized, worldview where we want to be Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and we want to be good boys and good girls. And that's great. But it tends to have a recapitulation in teenage years where there's another sort of an outburst of the warrior as we're civilizing ourselves. And Peterson's thesis, and the thesis of a lot of people, is that a lot of young people have not had that traditional have not been civilized. So they have that indolence, they have that aggression, they have that sense of entitlement or egocentrism that is has a lot of young people really stuck. And this is where Peterson is really doing God's work in giving these people a beautiful and powerful download of the values of traditionalism. And of course, as a result, he has a lot of support from the right. You had a positive column from Peggy Noonan and David Brooks, and here's one from Douglas Murray from The Spectator. And I think this gets to why the right loves him and why I think integralists should love him too, because this is a piece of the truth that the right has. And Murray writes, Peterson has made one of the most unpopular but vital realizations of our time, that we are creating a generation of men who, especially if they don't belong to any minority group, are without hope, foundation, or purpose. Everything in the culture insists that they are terrible. Proto-rapists when they are not rapists. Proto-racists when they are not racists. Condemned for their privilege, even when they are failures and their every success dismissed as undeserved. Peterson is one of the very few to take this problem seriously and to help young people to navigate towards lives of meaning and purpose. And that is, what he is overtly doing with this book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos. And again, the rules. I mean, at traditionalism, it's about rules and about roles and about being faithful to them and being, playing your role in your community and being faithful to your community and to your family and to your wife and your kids. And, it really, young people, particularly young white guys, yes, young white guys are eating it up. And so here's the 12 rules. I'm just going to read them because they make a sort of a beautiful whole just in and of themselves. So here we go. Rule number 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Rule number 2, treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. And I would also just say, as an integral practice, let this in. Feel this in your own mind, body, and see where it makes sense or where it might, point out a lack or some place where you could practice in growing. All right, so stand up straight with your shoulders back. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. Rule number 3, make friends with people who want the best for you. Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Rule 5, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Rule number 6, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Rule 8, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Rule number 9, assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. Rule number 10, be precise in your speech. Rule number 11, do not bother children when they are skateboarding. Rule number 12, pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. And, and he has a beautiful exposition of all of these. And, they all add up to, often a installation of values that people either didn't get because, religion and a lot of the patriotism, a lot of this stuff has been, poo-pooed by the green postmodern culture. And also, in some cases, it's young people who have been raised by postmodern parents who, just didn't think these values were important. And so you have both of these kinds of people, the people who just sort of culturally deprived, and the people who are sort of culturally deprived from, a higher stage, if you will. So it's without doubt been criticized. Of course, Peterson has a lot of enemies from the left mainly, and they either poo-poo him or they just sort of tar him with the some of the worst followers that he has. And here's one critique. I actually realized I didn't put down who wrote it, but this is from one of the book reviews. He says, "Imagine a Hobbesian view of existence: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, combined with the philosophy of Winnie the Pooh. You're braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think." And I think that's actually an accurate description of the book. Peterson does have this, he clearly has a well-identified idea of evil. This is also part of his traditional orientation. Good and evil are still very much polarized in his mind in a way that can be integrated, and I'll get to that in part 2. But he does have that. And then he also has this more modern view of you're braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, smarter than you think. You can do it. You could be all you can be. It's up to you. Self-responsibility and so forth. And I would point out that that's modern, not traditional. Traditional would say, trust God. God's braver than you believe, stronger than you think, smarter than you think. Give your life over to God. This is not that. This is more modern. So there's an integration right there. And then there's another critique, and again, I forgot who said it here, but from the left. And he wrote, I think it was a he, "Self-help is all well and good for getting one's life in shape." And he considers this a self-help book, which in a sense it is. "But when extrapolated to the level of national politics, the rhetoric of personal responsibility is a handy weapon for those who oppose single-payer healthcare," which actually Peterson does not oppose. He has a very kind of complex view of healthcare. So at any rate, one of the things that Peterson defends himself with, particularly when he is considered to be the philosopher of the alt-right, is that he is actually bringing people back to the center from the alt-right. And here he is on a famous interview with Vice, where he talks about this.
A lot of times you talk to these young men who are sort of flirting with far-right ideologies, and you try and bring them back. Like, what is that process like? How do you bring someone back from the far right?
Tell them a better story.
What is the better story?
Grow the hell up. Take your place in the world. You've got something to contribute. Make a plan. Live as an individual. Stay away from the identity politics pathology. It's just an excuse for failing to live your life in a respectable and noble manner. It's a way better story than like go wave your idiot far-right flag at some rally with a bunch of pasty-faced morons. What kind of pathetic behavior is that? So it's time to grow the hell up.
So that is the story he has to tell. And a lot of times this is the piece that they're actually missing. So Godspeed, Jordan Peterson, with that message to that audience. So, if we look at integral as being an integration of the previous stages, of the best of the previous stages, we can make a case that Jordan Peterson is, he has a pretty good flex flow mind. And I really do like the way he, despite his, fearlessness in terms of presenting a pretty extreme view of the world in a way, where this postmodernity is an evil wrong turn, that he has a certain kind of humility to it and a willingness to learn and grow that feels good. And he also has what I would consider an integral sensibility that moves beyond world centrism to what we would call cosmocentrism, when we start to perceive the bigger patterns that are behind the universe, one of which is evolution. We had the Big Bang and it sort of evolved into us. It's like weird. And that's, worth contemplating. Dirt got up and wrote poetry, as they say. That's kind of interesting. And so he has a view that becomes, I think, really inspiring when he helps people to see that they are part of this bigger pattern. And here's a piece that he did that I think expresses that very well. And this is also from, I believe, the Joe Rogan interview.
The world is a lesser place if you do not reveal from within yourself what you have to reveal. And the fact that the world is a lesser place actually turns out not to be trivial. Like, if you aren't everything you could be, more people will die, more people will suffer, more evil will be unconstrained, more tyranny will reign, more chaos will remain chaotic and dangerous, all of that.
Do you mean this by this in the sense of like the old proverb of the wings of a butterfly fluttering become a hurricane?
It's something similar to that, but it can even be more local. It's like your family is more messed up than it could be if you were less messed up than you are.
Right.
So if you just got your act together, like 10% more, your family would be 1% better.
Right.
It's like, well, do it.
And that would ripple off into the people that they interact with.
Yes, and it ripples fast.
Yes.
That's the other thing that's so cool, is that, like, people think, well, there's 7 billion of us, and each of us is just this separate dust mote, like floating in the cosmos, and what the hell difference does it make what you do anyways? It's like, that is not how we're connected. It's like, you're the center of a network, and you know way more people than this, but let's say typically, you're going to know 1,000 people in your life, well enough to have an impact on them, okay? And each of those 1,000 people is going to know 1,000 people. So you're 1 step from 1 million, and 2 steps from 1 billion. And we are networked, technically. That's how human interactions work. And so when you do something that you shouldn't do, it's worse than you think. And when you do something that you should do, it's better than you think.
So, I love that. And, that's starting to get in tune with a matrix of cause and effect, karma, that is beyond time and space. And it is beyond our normal understanding of how we're connected. And I really love that. So, I think that Peterson is adequately integral in these ways, certainly on his way, maybe a little short. And the problem is that he overemphasizes the disasters of postmodernity while just sort of accepting the contributions of postmodernity without seeing them as being a legitimate new stage of development. And because of that, because of seeing postmodernity as a fundamental wrong turn, he's left with integrating modernity and traditionalism. Any new emergent spirituality has to be sort of connected to a more traditional mythological point of view. And integral thinking really resolves that, because we can see that there's an integration of religion, of spirit, that is shorn of the mythological problems, that actually liberates religion into a new, bigger system. And I'm going to get into that in part 2 when I talk about, where Peterson's misunderstanding and where he puts this artificial ceiling on evolution and where it sort of causes him to, in my opinion, go astray. Welcome back to part 2 of my analysis of the Jordan Peterson phenomena through the lens of integral theory. In part 1, I explained a little bit about integral theory, and that it is the theory that human consciousness and cultures are evolving through discernible stages of development, and that there are 3 stages online currently in our developed world: traditionalism, modernity, and postmodernity. Each of these have their amazing gifts. Each were radical moves forward when they arose. Each arises in conflict with the previous and with the rejection of the previous. And as a result, each has its downside, not the least of which are its fanatics. So I also make the case that there's a new stage of human culture and consciousness that is arising, which we call the integral stage. It's the postmodern stage. It's the stage arising out of postmodernity. And it wants to befriend each of the previous stages and appreciate the piece of the truth that each has. And bring that to a larger system, a larger mind and heart that can contain opposites, that can hold paradox, that can, for instance, fully embrace science and fully embrace spirit. Rationality, myth, yin, yang. And, I explained that. I've explained that in many of my podcasts, and the integral movement is about that. And but I just want to give everybody a simple grounding. So I focused in part one also on the thesis that Jordan Peterson has many qualities of an integral thinker. He's, for one thing, he can straddle all three of these stages of development. That's sort of a beginning of an integration, that he can be in each of them. He is, adequately postmodern in the sense that he sees a legitimate role for the political left. He's for equal opportunities for women and minorities and so forth. That's how he defines it. But these are postmodern realizations. That he also has a foot in modernity in the sense that he is a college professor and he deals rationally and all of that sort of thing. But as I pointed out in part one, what makes Peterson especially interesting is that he has a center of gravity, and you might just call it his heart, that is at home at the traditional level. And his book, which is a big bestseller, 600,000 copies, probably more by now, is called 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos. And as I said, you couldn't cram more traditionalism in 8 words if you tried. Because, traditionalism is about rules and roles and men being men and women being women. And his rules themselves start with stand up straight with your shoulders back. And it's all about the basically downloading of the civilizing qualities of traditionalism on the chaotic qualities of pre-traditionalism, which is what we call the warrior stage of development. So it's about delaying gratification, being a good person, being honest, faithful. And he also has this idea of growth, and this growth to goodness and away from evil. And all of that is this, antidote to chaos. And also, as I pointed out, it's a great service. He's doing great integral work in the sense that he is become a spokesman for a group of people, and these are people who, for one reason or the other, have not gotten the traditionalist download, actually. A lot of young people, particularly young men, that, he provides a good, true and beautiful installation of the traditional stage. And, sometimes these young people didn't have good role models. Sometimes they had postmodern parents who took, they were kind of uncomfortable with traditionalism themselves, the idea of patriotism and ethnocentric and, religious, so these people don't have it. And so he's doing good work in that way. So I do think, and I ended, I think, part one with this thesis, that he makes a significant mistake in his view, in his philosophy, that creates a lot of consternation and conflict that I think integral can help sort out. And the mistake is that while we see postmodernity as being a stage of evolution that arises out of modernity. He sees postmodernity as being a mistake and being a wrong turn and a totalitarian ideology that he traces back to fascism and Maoism and earlier. And that is, a problem. So, there's an upside to this in the sense that he is at war with postmodernity and political correctness and all of the stuff that he's become famous for. And that, like I said, it actually provides an intellectual foundation for people who need that. And from an integral perspective, we're not necessarily against culture wars because we realize that conflict is one of the ways that we fight our way forward. But he is, to many of us, it's a philosophy that is boring because we're kind of over the fight and we see a way of integrating and there's a way of moving forward. And so that's what I want to talk about is, some of the particular problems that are caused by this idea that postmodernity is fundamentally a wrong turn. And I'm going to start here by playing an interview that Peterson had quite recently, I think, February 13th, with Jonathan Rowan, who is an integral thinker, clearly, and you'll see in this tape. And he gets at Jordan Peterson just on this issue of, can't we see postmodernity as a continued development of a self-authoring person? And Peterson says no, that it's a ideology, not a stage of development. And when he talks about stages of development here, he talks about equilibrated states. And this is a Piaget term for, what happens as children grow and they have these equilibrated states where they have a stability. And so that's just a little definition there. So let's go to this.
Got it. So if somebody's in one of those states, and that state just happens to be one of strong emphasis on inclusion, strong emphasis on dealing with past injustices, and strong emphasis on sort of, equalizing society in certain ways, they feel that that's what they're called upon to respond to. They feel as though that is their self-authorship, is to speak to that.
I don't believe it can be.
Okay, why not?
Because none of those are their ideas.
Well, what if
they're ideological ideas?
Well, is it not possible for someone to take upon themselves a critical relationship to that so that it becomes their own?
Yes.
Right.
It's definitely possible to do that, but it very rarely happens.
But it can happen, and that can be a good thing.
It's always a good thing when you take a set of abstract moral principles and unite them with your own experience. There's a deep Christian idea that you're supposed to imitate Christ, right? That's the deepest of Christian ideas. Jung wrote a lot about that. It's like, that doesn't mean you travel to the Middle East and dress in white robes and carry a cross. Like, that happened 2,000 years ago. What it means is that you bring the doctrine to life in your own life, right? Really in the specific particularities of your own life. And so the first thing I would say is that if you try to do that with an ideology, it immediately ceases to be an ideology, because you actually can't do that. Your life will burst the bounds of the ideology. But I would say that to the degree that you start to make the ideology truly personal, that you also start to transform it in ways that are beneficial. The problem with ideology is it's a universal set of solutions. And you think, well, that's great. It's like, well, yeah, except it eradicates the particularities. And that's not great at all.
So, ideology is tyrannical when we're sort of unconsciously subject to it and it's shaping our actions and our lives. But there's also a kind of ideology that's our own critical relationship to a set of ideas and how we embody them and experience them in our lives.
I wouldn't necessarily one of the things that I've strived to do is to distinguish between a genuine religious system and an ideology. An ideology is a parasite on a religious system. So a religious system has to have a variety of elements, and I detail them out a lot in Maps of Meaning. I won't go through them. But it's the thing about a religious view of the world is that the positives and negatives are both included. So the individual is a hero, but also an adversary.
Culture is a tyrant, but also a wise king. Nature is a beautiful, wondrous, revolutionary, transformative force, and also cancer and Anopheles mosquitoes and the plague. And ideologies don't play that game. They pick and choose their narrative characters.
No, I understand, but surely it's possible then along those same lines for someone to say, look, white privileged men are fine and often wonderful people doing great work, but they have too much power, and there are other people who don't have access to those worlds and those opportunities because of that.
As soon as they
bias.
use the terminology white privilege, I'm out of the discussion.
Right, well, is that not going too far? That sounds ideological to me. I mean, that sounds like something that you're subject to, that you can't see beyond or relate to.
No, I don't think so. I think it's part of the nexus of...
You're captive to that critique in such a way that you can't see any possible good in it.
No, I understand the motivations that are driving the use of that terminology, I think, better than the person who's using the terms.
But in your experience, in a particular context,
yeah.
But this issue is happening around the world in multiple contexts,
yeah.
where people who feel marginalized, who feel they have, feel they've lost out in certain ways, who might try and tidy the room, might try and sort themselves out, but still find they can't get a job, can't get enough money, can't get access to a life they want.
I'm not clear at all that that's the case in the West. No, I don't believe that. I mean, we know perfectly well, for example, that the best predictors of success in the West are intelligence and conscientiousness.
Right.
All right, there's a lot there to unpack, and I'm going to do that in the rest of this podcast, but just a couple things quickly. When he talks about when you try to make a religion out of an ideology, it immediately ceases to be an ideology, and your life will burst the bounds of the ideology. And that's true, but what we would say from an integral perspective is that every stage has an ideology, first of all. Every stage has what he's calling a universal set of solutions that eradicate the particularities. Traditionalism, for instance, Christianity, it's indeed saturated in terms of meaning. And it is also delivers a universal solution, accept Jesus, and asks for obedience and conformity. And at some point, human evolution bursts out of that. And we burst out of all stages because we get the download that they are there to deliver to us. At modernity, the idea is that everybody becomes rational, that human rights, not obedience, but that my own volition matters. That becomes the new ideology, the new, in a sense, religion. Postmodernity has a universal set too. Postmodernity, it's funny, and we need to respect postmodernity for this. After the first half of the 20th century, with all of its totalitarian world wars, bombs, the whole bit, the next stage of development was a stage of development that became sensitive. That's not an ideology. That's an unfolding of human history in the breast of people for whom it happened. And it's a sensitivity that wants to rehabilitate, to rescue, to bring back online the people who have been left behind by the previous stages, the losers in modernity, the people who can't compete. They don't have a lot of merit for the meritocracy. The people in traditionalism who are the sinners, the heretics, the people in the earlier stages who are basically the impoverished, the prey, the serfs. All these people who, that's what postmodernity's ideology is, but it's also more than that. They're all more than that. So we can look at it in terms of one of the big bugaboos that Jordan Peterson talks about, and a lot of people who are his fans do, and they're right, actually, but it's the idea of political correctness and controlled speech and thought. And that's really what got him on the national stage or the international stage about a year and a half ago, when he refused to go along with a new code in the Civil Rights Code in Canada. He's a professor at Toronto University, that he would not use gender-neutral pronouns because it was a law and that was forced speech. And so that's really been the pivot for his his movement of the intellectual world, which has really happened. But what we can see is that there's a political correctness at every stage of development. At traditional, you don't want to blaspheme God. It can be bad for you if you do. And that's even today in theocracies where you could be whipped for saying the wrong thing. So the idea that political correctness is just a postmodern phenomena, there's always been a thought police, there's always been a speech police, and it was far more and is far more brutal in traditionalism than it is in postmodernity. Also in traditionalism, they're just naturally what we would call racist. They would say, clannish. They trade on patronage. They're tribal. They preference their people over the others. And that is an ever-increasing circle as we evolve, of the people that are inside our circle as part of us, the same as us, and the people who are outside who are not as worthy of moral consideration. And, so that's traditionalism, and it's just naturally that way. It's racist in that way that, most of human history has been. So modernity also has a political correctness and a thought police, in a sense. Think about it. If you're at a meeting at work and somebody starts arguing for a plan of action because God revealed it to them in a vision, well, let's just say that would be politically incorrect, And yet that kind of argument, that God revealed it to me, this is what we should do, people, that would be absolutely acceptable at the earlier stages, both traditionalism and earlier. In fact, it would probably win the day, depending on how beautifully you transmitted it, if God's voice came out of a burning bush or something. But in the modern world, you're just going to creep everybody out, So, there's a thought and speech police there, and it has been well enforced. And in the postmodern world, they have one too. And in this case, the poster boy is the guy who worked at Google, who violated the new postmodern speech code by saying things about women and men, that they have differences and preferences and personalities that are hardwired and so forth, and presented evidence and whatever. You can take it or leave it. But it offended the sensibility of his coworkers because the center of gravity there, at least in the human resources department and so forth, is postmodern. And so he was fired. And I don't like that. From an integral perspective, we're hip to all of it. And we want to recognize it everywhere it shows up. But we also don't want to see it as some, malevolent recapitulation of the gulag that is trying to drag us back into some dark pit of evil. It's just the thought police, that's all. And actually at postmodern, it is relative to the earlier stages, pretty benign. Which is not to say that it is benign and that it ought not be fought. And this is where I support Peterson. There is a new dominator hierarchy that takes place at postmodernity. And, I get it from my own experience. I was at the Masters of Divinity program at Naropa University here in Boulder, which is a small private university, Buddhist-based, founded by the Tibetan Rinpoche, Chogyam Trungpa. And very postmodern, also a lot of integral sensibilities at Naropa. But when I was there, it was particularly postmodern. And the dominator hierarchy had been inversed, so that the more victim status you could have, whether you're a woman, you're poor, of color. I was gay, thank God, because otherwise I was a middle-aged white guy who was there as a dilettante, and I still had to pay. But it can be brutal. It really can. And there were times when I was just shut down, and you learned what you could say and what you couldn't. But over time, our little cadre, there were like 14 of us, we sorted it out, at least to the point where we loved each other. We certainly loved each other at the end. Did we convince each other? No. but we had beaten our swords into plowshares for the most part. But it's clearly a problem, and I think one that has gotten far worse in academia particularly. Andrew Sullivan published an article, I think it's in New York Magazine recently, where he talked about take it seriously. Take the postmodern or the progressive thought police seriously, because it's escaping the academia and has entered the human resources department. Peterson talks about this too, sort of the whole human resource profession in companies and corporations, and to be aware of it, and that there's the bad shit that's the part of it. So fair enough. And we do want to notice that. And we are, against dominator hierarchies. Now, I would also say, and this is from a integral point of view, we want to see the piece of the truth that the postmodern progressives bring to the party that weren't there before. And I think of my classmates at Naropa in the MDiv department, and these were what you would call, in fact, we called ourselves proudly this at the time, social justice warriors. That's become a sort of a epithet lately. But they were that in the best sense of the word. As I said, I was there, as a lark, but these people were there to work their asses off for the disadvantaged and the animals and the environment and the whole postmodern agenda for very little money. And that was what they were dedicating their life to. And what is it that they see? They don't opt out of the white privilege conversation. And I do think that Rowan was right to challenge Peterson that, boy, that you opt out of any conversation about that is seems ideological. And it does, because, clearly white privilege has existed in our culture. And here's where Peterson is right, and a lot of people who argue this are right. It has been made illegal in the exteriors. That is, you are not allowed to discriminate according to race or religion or female, male, and that sort of thing. That's all illegal. That is enormous progress. But what the postmodernists also realize is that there's an internal racism that's, more unconscious, and sexism, where if you have, think about it yourself, do a little thought experiment. If you get a resume from a young John Smith versus Juan Smith versus Jamal Smith, there's research to say that John Smith gets, I don't know how many times more responses than Juan, who gets more responses than Jamal. That's all part of what is being pointed out here. And sort of the unconscious norms where in workplaces where men unconsciously dominate and women unconsciously submit, there's nothing wrong with pointing that out. In looking at that. That doesn't mean that Western civilization has to be dismantled. It means that we can move forward, and we have been. And I think the Me Too movement is an enormous move forward in a wringing out of a sexism that wasn't unconscious at all, it was conscious. And all of a sudden, it becomes outrageous. It was accepted, and Harvey Weinstein was joked about at the Oscars for years. Everybody knew. And then all of a sudden, it's outrageous. Now, you can see there's moral preening, and there's all kinds of crap, that comes along with it. But we can all feel it in our own, the shift. This is raising consciousness, people. This is the realization that women get to have a sphere of safety, and even if they're wearing high heels, even if they're wearing lipstick and Peterson has this famous interview with Vice where he talks about, these are sexual signals. We haven't sorted this out. He's right. But we are sorting it out. I mean, his thing is we don't know what the rules are. Now, it's very traditional. He wants the rules. Well, the rules are a moving, it's a moving target. So, these are all worth staking out. And I would also point out that just as the extremists at every level, the religious fanatics that go off in the monastery or whatever, we don't want them to be violent, but the people who are scientific materialists to the point where everything is reduced to stuff, to material, and to postmodernists who are, the extreme of the social justice warriors. They are staking out territory for all of humanity. You don't have to buy the whole thing to get the appropriate download, but they are increasing the playing field. And that's worthy, and it's also liberating in a way. I mean, it's like this this consent movement, if you will, that is going on in campuses where, it's not just no means no, it's yes means yes, that you have to have an affirmative consent in order to have sex. And, when people first started talking about that, I thought, oh, please, But, the more I think about it, is it actually the worst thing in the world that a young man and a young woman would actually talk and connect over what they want to do sexually and be conscious about it, even in real time? And is that ultimately a wet blanket? Or is that a liberation? And I would argue for the latter. And I would use something that Peterson talks about a lot. And it's this idea that, what's up with this 50 Shades of Grey in this whole bondage and discipline movement? And he thinks it's a shadow of the anti-masculinity that is part of postmodernity. And he may be right about that. There's probably some truth to that. But it is also the community, the people who do that stuff have super juicy sex. And it's just one of the central tenets of the whole thing is that you communicate. And you say what your safe word is, and you say what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. And when you put that out on the table and say, okay, baby, here I am, then that is a liberation to actually bring back online the masculine, feminine polarity, I could say, but also just the polarity of domination and submission, which is just part of the juice of being human. For most of human history, that's all we had was domination and submission. We have stages, we have levels that have been built on top of that civilize it and have rejected it and have sort of tried to put it in the shadows. But further development says, hey, wait a second, let's bring that out of the shadow and let's play with that and let's have a good time. And I think that's actually where we're headed. In the sacred world to come, as I say, we're going to be riding each other around like ponies. But we're going to be doing it deliberately, consciously, joyfully, and we're going to have all kinds of ways of being together that are conscious. So, I'm kind of good with how some of this is unfolding. So this whole idea of domination and submission and dominator hierarchies is a big part of Jordan Peterson's sort of thesis about life. And he, his first chapter of his book is about, by the way, here's his book, 12 Rules for Life. And he's starts out with the lobsters and how they dominate each other and how just domination is, and dominator hierarchies are built into the system. And that they're still online. They are still online for sure, but there are stages beyond dominator hierarchies. For one thing, postmodernity comes in and seeks to eliminate all hierarchies. All these historic narratives of superiority of my religion, my people, all of that horse shit is, there is no truth. It's all just flat land. And that's actually progress. It doesn't feel like progress, especially if it's your dominator hierarchy that's being gored. But it does clear the system for the next stage of development, which is an understanding that Integral is trying to get its arms around. And that is this idea of natural hierarchy, or chief of which is evolution itself, development, that 9-year-olds are not defective 12-year-olds, and that then there's 18-year-olds, and that each of them is precious, 100%, and each of them has this different capacities and capabilities, including some that 9-year-olds have that 18-year-olds don't, like magic, things like that. So, we can sort this all out, but I want to play a piece from Peterson talking to Camille Paglia, I believe was her name, Paglia, who I often love. She's a sort of an iconoclastic. She considers herself transgender. She used to be a lesbian, and she's a great iconoclastic thinker. She's also, like Peterson, polarized against postmodernity.
Now, but here's the problem. This is something my wife has pointed out too. She said, well, men are going to have to stand up for themselves. But here's the problem. I know how to stand up to a man who's unfairly trespassing against me. And the reason...
And actually, I do want to say that before this, they were talking about people who come to his talks, and there's one particular woman who is organizing resistance and counter demonstrations to his talks, and calls him a Nazi and so forth, and has swastikas and the whole bit. So that's what he's talking about.
The reason I know that is because the parameters for my resistance are quite well defined, which is we talk, we argue, we push, and then it becomes physical, right? Like if we move beyond the boundaries of civil discourse, we know what the next step is. Okay, that's forbidden in discourse with women. And so I don't think that men can control crazy women. I really don't believe it. I think that they have to throw their hands up in it's not even disbelief. It's that there's no step forward that you can take under those circumstances, because if the man is offensive enough and crazy enough, the reaction becomes physical right away, or at least the threat is there. And when men are talking to each other in any serious manner, that underlying threat of physicality is always there, especially if it's a real conversation, and it keeps the thing civilized to some degree. If you're talking to a man who wouldn't fight with you under any circumstances whatsoever, then you're talking to someone to whom you have absolutely no respect. But I can't see any way. For example, there's a woman in Toronto who's been organizing this movement, let's say, against me and some other people who are going to do a free speech event, and she managed to organize quite effectively, and she's quite offensive, you might say. She compared us to Nazis, for example, which, publicly, using the swastika, which wasn't really something I was all that fond of. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who was employing those tactics are forbidden to me. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, it seems to me that it isn't men that have to stand up and say enough of this, even though that is what they should do. It seems to me that it's sane women who have to stand up against their crazy sisters and say, look, enough of that, enough man-hating, enough pathology, enough bringing disgrace on us as a gender. But the problem there, and then I'll stop my little tirade, is that most of the women I know who are sane are busy doing sane things, right? They're off, they have their career, they have their family, they're quite occupied, and they don't seem to have the time or maybe even the interest to go after their crazy harpy sisters. And so I don't see any regulating force for that terrible femininity. And it seems to me to be invading the culture and undermining the masculine power of the culture in a way that's, I think, fatal. I really do believe that.
I too believe that this is symptomatic of the decline of Western culture, and it will just go down flat. I don't think people realize that, you know, masculinity still exists, okay, in the world as a code among jihadists, okay, and when you have passionate masculinity, okay, circling the borders like the Huns and the Vandals during the Roman Empire, that's what I see. I see this culture rotting from within, okay, and disemboweling itself, literally. Now,
all right. So once again, I think you see a astounding overstatement of, you know, the being surrounded by the Huns and the Vandals and disemboweling ourselves and with the, you know, fashion, all that stuff. It reminds me of where a lot of my liberal, bolder friends go with Trump. You know, that he's Hitler, and, you know, we're going back to the, you know, Kristallnacht. But, you know, it's effective in stirring up the troops, I guess, and these, maybe there's something functional there, but again, just so boring in a way, and so it seems so unnecessarily, you know, alarming or alarmist. And regarding this idea that we are in danger of regressing to the circumstances of the first half of the 20th century with these world wars and fascism and communism and all of that, I think integral theory can actually help us understand what's going on here and take a little heart in where we've come. It's true that these were in many ways modern countries that did this. They were technological, they were scientific. Germany, Japan, the United States, all of us were in a technological world. We were in the middle of the 20th century. But we still had traditional interiors. And that's the nature of evolution, is that, you know, we see it as coming online. A simple way of seeing it is it comes online in first person in terms of our own consciousness. It comes online and unfolds in terms of second person, in terms of the culture and how we relate to each other and identify. And in third person, in terms of the technology and the systems that we create for ourselves, from horticulture to agriculture to, you know, industrial and so forth. And you can see as we walk up these stages of development that those change. But it's not always even. And so the first half of the 20th century can be seen as sort of the opposite of a sweet spot in history. It was a sour spot in history, where countries had become modern in terms of weaponry and logistics and concentration camps and nukes and all of that. But they hadn't become modern in the interiors. The humanist thing hadn't fully come online. There was still this idea of romantic nationalism and militant nationalism, and you know, where my group, my nation, is superior, and the, you know, uber man, and we need to dominate. And that's traditionalism and warrior, and previous to that, that's human history. Genocide is nothing new in human history. It was standard procedure for most of human history. But to do it with modern technology has a certain kind of extra horror to it that actually is what moved the culture forward, so that we have post-World War II, this period of long peace that is often commented on, this radical diminishment of violence in all areas of life in the modern world, where modernity and the sense of the rights of every individual, and even post-modernity, where this idea of one culture being better than the other is sort of dismantled, that this is progress. And so we end up with people who are modern in the interiors as well. And what you realize at modernity in the interiors is fighting doesn't get you where trading does. I mean, you move from, you know, dominating to let's play together. And as I said, this is the way we fight our way forward, and we also, the other F word, our way forward. And so this is the so modern sensibility that has, Germany and Japan being the most civilized nations on earth. They're great global citizens. And the idea that Germany would attack France, I mean, it's just, it's off the table, and we can rely. That's reliable. That regression's not going to happen absent some, complete, asteroid hits or something, where all of a sudden we're back in the Stone Age. Now, when I say that these cultures have become modern in the interiors, I would say that roughly 2/3 of the populations of these countries have become modern in the interiors. There's still a traditional strata that all of us can feel in our own minds and bodies, even if we've transcended it, we do include it. But there are some people that's their center of gravity. And they, in America, they still don't get how we could still be at war 15 years later in Afghanistan when we could have bombed them back to the Stone Age. But fortunately, this is moral development. The majority of people don't feel that way. And that's a ratcheting up that is reliable. So I think we could take some faith in that, which is a traditional value. You have faith in the system, faith in God. We've grown up. And even his specific complaint here, where he talks about he's defenseless against these women, and that the recourse that he has with men, which is to punch them, is forbidden to him with women. And that I'm not sure he thinks that's necessarily a bad thing, but he feels that constraint. And, he has many options open to him with his detractors and with this woman. He could walk away. He could make his own sign that says, "No, lady, you're the Nazi." He could use his amazing verbal acuity and vast knowledge to win an argument with her. One of his fans, or make her look bad. One of his fans can videotape it and put it on the internet. There are countless such videos like that on the internet. And he says, "I don't know how you control crazy women." Well, if you get a restraining order if you have to, but you don't bemoan the fact that you can't punch them. And what you actually ought to do at some point, when you are over, the passion of the moment, go off and lick your wounds and consider whatever nugget of the truth this woman might have in her big basket of crazy, because there probably is one. And so where he's coming from is from, again, this traditionalist center of gravity where, the threat is always there of physical violence. It's what keeps the world civilized. And it's true. It does keep the pre-modern world civilized. Fear of, physical violence is what works there. But after modernity fully comes online, you don't do that anymore. That doesn't mean that you don't defend yourself against pre-modern people. If you are approached in a dark alley and mugged by somebody, you want to be able to turn into a lethal weapon. And so physicality is absolutely part of it. And we want even that Red Warrior thing online. But only in self-defense, only when we need it, only when we're dealing with pre-modern people in a violent situation that they started. And that's a pretty bright line that I think actually keeps the world civilized. And yet that's not, there's an honor, there's a feeling of, he talks about it a lot. He's ambivalent about gay marriage because he thinks, it messes with institutions that have been here forever. It's not a matter of rights for him. He talks about that he would never marry a woman who wouldn't take his last name. Yesterday, he tweeted to this critic who wrote a article, Pakja Mishra. He wrote Jordan Peterson and Fascist Mysticism in the New York Review. I'm not sure where it is. I'll link to it. But Peterson tweeted, "Are you calling me a fascist, you sanctimonious prick? If you were in my room at the moment, I'd slap you happily." So, so meeting insult with violence, not good. And actually, the article that Pankaj Mishra wrote is one of the more thoughtful critiques of his book. I've read many that were just plain old snide and just didn't get it and didn't even try. This guy traces, the sort of fascist impulse through Jung and Joseph Campbell and a lot of Peterson's heroes. And, believe me, this guy needs a good dose of integral thinking too. But at least it was thoughtful. And anyway. All right. So, and I do want to say the other thing about fascism and Maoism and all of that stuff. Clearly, that did arise, and I think Jordan Peterson's thesis that when modernity comes in and science undermines the belief in God and religion is weakened, that means that you're weakening the culture's adherence to the ethics of that religion. And when you weaken those ethics, you leave a void, and it can be filled with this, craziness, or this sort of new secular religion of Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot and Mao Zedong and all of them, and that free speech is the antidote to that, and that's fair enough. But the problem with the way Peterson treats religion, and religion's a big part of his thing. And again, I'm going to make a distinction between, do I think that the way Peterson handles religion in his book is very fruitful for the people who it is meant for? Yes. He brings he's rooted in Christianity. He's done many lectures on the sort of archetypal and mythological and moral gifts of Christianity. He's ambivalent about, is Christianity literally true? But that's good, because a lot of the people that he's dealing with, they can't quite go there either. But they do want the download of what Christianity brings, the upside of the download, if you will. And but if you think that Christianity or these great axial religions are the only religions, and everything that came since then have been ideologies, then you've put a ceiling on evolution. You're not seeing that these are actually all unfolding worldviews, and that modernity's wringing out of the magic and enchantment of life is as painful as it is, and as how unwilling people are to go with that, and they should be. It is a necessary stage. And then postmodernity starts bringing sort of irrational religion back on, and we'll do dances in the woods and sweat lodges and so forth. And Peterson actually does that, by the way. He is he's affiliated somehow with one of the indigenous Canadian tribes in his part of the world. And, has done stuff with them and is very respectful and very respected. And so that's all good, but still there's that lid that he imposes, that ceiling that just stops the process of evolution. And it leads to things like this. And here's a quote. He says, "I think the Bible is true, but I don't know what that means. I don't know how to reconcile it with the idea, for example, that the universe is 13 billion years old, or that we evolved over this 4 billion year period from nothing, essentially. There is this overlay on top of this mythological landscape that is also true, but I don't know how both of these can be true at the same time." And let me say that from an integral perspective, I know how they can both be true at the same time. They're both true in different domains. Is Christianity true? Yes. It's truer than true, in the sense that it's capital T true, which means it's true without necessarily being accurate in its particularities. But it downloads codes and instructions for life. It tells us a story, as all great religions do, of a world that is bigger than this life and that is drenched in meaning. And by receiving that, we feel enlarged and enlightened and enlivened. And even better than that, we feel seen and loved. And that's really, in my sense, the big problem with his way of dealing with Christianity is that, when you talk about the moral teachings of Christianity, all great, love the neighbor, all that good stuff. When you talk about the archetypes, of the virgin birth and the sacrifice and death and resurrection, these are great. The virgin birth is just an acknowledgement, it's in many cultures, of that we are born not just of the mother and father, but of the indwelling spirit that is, part of the fabric of the universe, that is the loving intelligence, the creative force of the universe. That's that. The sacrifice, death, and resurrection is an ongoing process of laying down our small self and sacrificing it so that we can get bigger. And, these are all beautiful. And but there's another stage where it is actually true too, where there is a loving creator God, for lack of a better word, who not only has all these lessons, all these wonderful archetypes and things that we want to imitate Christ, all that good stuff, but is also living and sees me and loves me and holds me precious, and that I can relate to and I can surrender to and I can sit in his or her its lap, and I can be lived instead of just living, and this world is not my home, and it's mysterious, and I can use the myths, and I can use all the teachings of all the religions, all the way back to the magical and all of that good stuff, as beautiful art forms, as transmissions, but I don't have to hold them as being true in the exteriors, which is the domain of science. So, for me to believe that Jesus walked on the water, I'd need a videotape. I'm very comfortable saying that probably didn't happen. Do I rule it out entirely? No. It's a mysterious world. But I think I feel comfortable going forward with the idea that, I could throw that bathwater out and still keep the living, precious, personal presence of a creator God. And at Integral, we can tease those things apart and hold them both fully at the same time, not in some blenderized, homogenized way, but we can hold them fully. And that's a good thing. So yeah, science does wring the magic out of life, temporarily, till we move beyond, that sort of hard materialist modernity. But paradoxically, it does actually deliver to us a very beautiful and potent new creation story that tells us that 13.8 billion years ago, something blew out of nothing and turned into stardust, which turned into dirt, and the earth happened, and then dirt got up and wrote poetry, and dirt got up and became you and me in this moment. And wow, that's the story of evolution, of this, flourishing of creativity and complexity, and we would argue consciousness that was there at the beginning and just continues to complexify in ways that are jaw-dropping. And that there is a spiritual path in there somewhere, that there's a new religion to be had that that passes all the tests of science, except the science test that says material is the only thing that's real. And I'm with Jordan Peterson here, where I don't see any reason to believe that the only thing that's real is dead matter that has this sort of subjective delusion of being real at some level of complexity. But that living spirit is also a piece of it and is evolving with it. And it's material, it's mysterious, but it's also illuminating and enlivening and enlarging and very, very beautiful, very good, true, and beautiful. So yeah, so I think I'll end it there. Like I said, I do think that he is very evolutionarily potent. He is a very, very worthy spokesman and fighter for a worldview that needed to be brought back online in a healthier way. And I think that by not seeing that evolutionary force continues, that he gets sidetracked and goes down a lot of rabbit holes that are interesting for people who like rabbit holes. And there are a lot of people who do, and that's part of the process of, people who are downloading this. They need to fight. They need to get in the game. They need to get in the arena with the infidels. Fair enough, as long as it's nonviolent. And you don't smack people, Jordan. But beyond that, there's a way of holding it all that is, I think, far bigger and far more alive and comprehensive and all kinds of other good words, I'm sure. All right, so thank you so much, everybody, for listening. If you're interested in some of the stuff I've been talking about, I've done many, many, many podcasts on all of these topics in culture and religion and politics and Trump and all of it. You can find that at thedailyevolver.com. I'm also on Integral Life. I do live webcasts there. You can go to Integral Life and see the work of Ken Wilber. You can read his books. The Brief History of Everything's a good start. Steve McIntosh's Evolution's Purpose. There is a whole integral community of people who are working with this, what we see as the next stage of human unfolding into an ever-increasing dimensions of goodness, truth, and beauty, to which I say hallelujah, and check it out if you're interested. Okay, thanks again. See you next time on The Daily Evolver.